So, David, it's really good. It's really good to see you. How are you holding up today?
Today, I'm holding up okay. I think it's just, you know, the last nearly year has just been so insane that any one day can change pretty drastically. I woke up this morning and I wasn't dead, which that feels like a victory. So, I'm working on an issue of Bitterroot right now, which is set to come out in about a month and a half, 2 months, and yeah, just actually doing some rewrites before the letterer gets to it. So that's what today is looking like for me.
Well, and I think that's a good place to start. I mean, Bitterroot. You got your first Eisner with Bitterroot.
Mm-hmm.
You've also got it's been optioned for a movie.
Yep.
And that's not the only piece of your work that's been optioned for a movie. But we'll start there before we go into your embarrassment of riches.
Okay. Yeah. Yep. So embarrassing.
But yeah, I mean, we're gosh, I was gonna say we're coming out of a pandemic. No, we're just going deeper and deeper down the drain. But I mean, it's got to be quite a contrast to at the same time, it's like to be hunkered down like this, and then to also have these projects that are just so much bigger than the world inside your window, right?
Yeah.
Between Bitterroot and also Naomi, I mean, and they're great projects. I mean, what I love about both of them is that the first one, you got Bitterroot, which is, I mean, I described it myself as like very much a Black Power fantasy, right?
Mm-hmm.
A story about a family of monster hunters who and I want to say happen to be Black, but it's not that they happen to be Black. They are intentionally Black.
Yeah.
And race informs the story, but it doesn't inform it in like the more traditional ways, right? It's what you've got is a story where they're fighting these monsters that are people who have been literally transformed into monsters by their racism, right?
Yeah.
Tell me a little bit about that.
Well, it was meant to be sort of a metaphor, and and more of a figurative demonstration of hatred and racism. And unfortunately, what we've seen play out in the news lately has been that, oh yeah, no, the monsters are real, and they are a threat to all of us. And the question that, I felt really proud of myself when I'd come up with this idea as we were developing Bitterroot of, oh, if they're monster hunters, let's make the monsters more than the typical monsters. Let's do this thing where it's people who've been infected by hatred and racism. And the moment we came up with that idea, we're patting ourselves on the back, and never did we stop to think about what the implications were of trying to cure somebody of this ailment. And it was right as the first issue was getting ready to come out. No one had actually read it other than a handful of people, when I started thinking, oh wow, this is like not the smartest thing we've ever done, right? Because I don't want to put a book out that seems to imply that all you have to do is give a horrible racist a vaccine and they're going to be better, right? And so now it's evolved into this a much deeper, complex story that is interesting, because as I watch the news on a daily basis, I see us as a society grappling with the exact same things that this family is grappling with. And so, was it our intention to do that? No. Is it happen? Yep, it certainly has. And now, so now I think about it more, and I think about the importance of what sort of representations do we put forward in our work. And for me, there's difficult times, because like today is, anyone who's read Bitterroot knows that there's sort of two sides of the family conflict. There's the side of the family who believes that the monster should be cured, And then there's the side that believes there is no cure and they should just be destroyed, right? And so the question people always ask me is like, well, which side do you fall on? You know? And then today, as I look at the news, I'm like, well, isn't it obvious? I fall on the side that says there is no cure. You know, there's this country has had a very long time to look for the cure and to deal with the disease. And every time that they've chosen to not deal with it. And I was thinking about in 1963 when President Kennedy was killed and Malcolm X said, this is an example of the chickens coming home to roost. I think we can look back on hindsight and say, no, that wasn't the chickens coming home to roost. This right now, what's happening in the streets of Washington, D.C. is that. And so to me, it's you know, I grapple with that. I grapple with that as we're working on Bitterroot right now. Like, how do we stay relevant and entertaining without being dogmatic, without being, you know, without getting so high up on a soapbox that it just isn't fun anymore. And so, you know, that's one of the things that keeps me up at night. How do I make it fun? How do I make it entertaining, you know?
Well, first of all, I think it is entertaining, but
Thank you.
I also think what's interesting is the way in which you use racism. I mean, it starts as a metaphor, but you talk about its transformative elements. I think that's what's interesting is you tap into something that we really don't see being discussed. We don't talk a lot about racism as being transformative. We talk about it in terms of like racism as being this thing that moves people to do horrific things, right? But we don't really talk about that, and to the extent that we do, we don't talk about the real implications of that transformation, right?
Yep.
Even this whole debate of like, well, do you destroy them, or do you try and come up with a spell to like transform them back? Then the question is, can they really be transformed them back? Because, you know, you turn them back, you get rid of their hatred, and they just accumulate new things to hate, right?
Yeah.
You know, I think that is, I think that's part of the brilliance of just going into something like a really simple metaphor like that. But I also think it also layers onto the world that you've built, right? Where it's a world that acknowledges the different race riots, be they in Chicago or in Oklahoma, right? You know, and it actually brings it in, and I think that's what makes this this really interesting, and why, you know, I describe it as a Black Power fantasy, because regardless of what side you come down on as a reader, ultimately it is not the decision of white people whether or not it's going to be destroy them or try and reverse the transformation, right?
Yeah.
It is ultimately in the hands, that the power to address racism is in the hands of Black people, right?
Yeah.
And I think that also is something that we don't, it's not the way in which you know, America traditionally tells this kind of story, right? Usually it's, oh, let's bring in the good white person.
Yeah.
You know.
Solves all the problems, teaches the kids how to play basketball, solves all the problems, and everything's fine. And, you know, and it's interesting because it's I don't necessarily think that I realize that now what Bitterroot means to me is something different. And I think the readers will catch up as the story progresses further, because really the story to me is it's about what pain and grief and trauma does to Black folks and how it transforms us. And in that transformation, we are having to deal with the monsters that inflicted that pain, that grief and trauma on us. And how do we survive them, right? And because like what you were saying is like we have, like Black folks don't have the power to stop racism. All we do is have the power to deal with it. And what does that turn us into? And so it becomes this issue of, when you look at the systemic oppression that's gone on in the Black community forever, the economic, disparities and all of those things. And it's like, well, we survived them. The fact that we can historically look back and we can listen to jazz, or we can listen to hip hop, or we can listen to the blues, and then the Harlem, and all the art that came out during the Harlem Renaissance, which is where our story takes place, where Bitterroot takes place, is all a testimony to how we survive it, right? And so that's what this is really becoming, and that's, for me, that's what it's becoming. Sometimes Chuck Sanford and I disagree on things, and that's fine. Even the Eagles didn't agree on everything that they did musically. So, but I do think that it's an interesting story to grapple with, and I think for me as a creator, it's interesting to grapple with it, because this is what I grapple with every day. I think this is what a lot of us grapple with every day. It's what do you do with not only what do you do with the pain and the anger, right? Because most of us, I believe that most of our anger collectively as a group of people, I think most of our anger is just a transformation of incredible grief and sorrow, right? It's like you take a piece of coal and you apply enough pressure to it and it becomes a diamond, right? Well, if you take enough sadness and misery in Black people and push down hard enough, it then turns to anger, right? And we've been conditioned in such a way historically to internalize our anger, to take it out on ourselves as a society and as individuals. And so for me, part of what I'm doing with this book is trying to work through some of my own issues. This is just like a therapy thing for me,
Well, it's interesting as you talk about it that way, because I kind of see, I also see Bitterroot in a continuum. Before Bitterroot, there was Nighthawk and Power Man and Iron Fist, right? And after Bitterroot, or not, well, when I say after, having started after Bitterroot started, is Naomi, right? Which I get the sense is there are elements of a very personal story in there, right? It's definitely taking place in the Pacific Northwest, right? Yeah. It's the story of a young Black girl who discovers that she's got, that she's got extra dimensional origins and all sorts of amazing superpowers to come with it. Yeah. And some weird connection to some other characters in the DCU. It's not about fighting. It's not about fighting racism in its most in your face form, but it is about the struggle of self-definition, right? Yeah. And especially the struggle of self-definition for a young Black woman in a place that doesn't have a lot of space for a young Black woman.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, and that's, when Brian Bendis and I first came up with the idea and started developing the story and the character of Naomi, this is part of what we talked about. We both live in Portland. We've been friends for a long time, and neither of us are actually from here. So we're both from places that are traditionally a little bit more diverse than the city that we both now call home. But even for myself, I grew up in a part of the country where my little pocket was in a predominantly white environment, just on the outskirts of a larger Black population. And so to me, most of my life has been spent as sort of this outsider, looking out at this other world I wanted to be part of, that being the world of Blackness, I guess, for lack of a better term. And then, but also being locked outside of the world that I was in that immediate moment, right? And that was with, school and peers and all that sort of stuff. And to me, I feel like can be a universal feeling. There is no monolithic Black experience in America, but there are some experiences that a lot of us have gone through. And I think that as a nerd, as a self-professed nerd and someone who loves comics and has spent a lot of time in that circle, like I know that feeling of alienation on that level too, right? And one of the things I thought about, and Brian and I talked about when we were creating Naomi, was what it's like to feel like an outsider, right? And how do we channel that, and how do we get people to relate to a character on a level that speaks to them, even if the character doesn't look like them or doesn't share some of their same backgrounds. And that's a lot of what we really put into Naomi. And I remember thinking at the time about, when I was in elementary school, there was only like maybe 5 or 6 Black kids in the entire school out of a few thousand students. There's like maybe 5 or 6 Black students, but there was only one girl, right? This is kindergarten through 6th grade. It was if there were 6 of us, it was 5 boys and 1 girl. If it was 10 of us, it was 9 boys and 1 girl. But so I can't tell you exactly how many boys there were. I could if I went back and looked at like the class pictures and yearbooks and all that stuff. But there was always one Black girl, right? Her name was Linda Tate. And even then, as a kid, I was like, man, like as difficult as it is for me, I couldn't quite articulate it the way I am now. But I was like, right, man, this must suck to be like this, And that's not to say that being a girl sucked or being Black sucked. That the difficulty was just in being the only person around you, and also having it pointed out to you how different you are. And right. and I think that that's another thing that a lot of us, if you want to call it the Black nerd realm, can identify with, because it's one thing to maybe not belong if you go to a predominantly white school or something like that, to not necessarily feel like you fit in there, but then to go back to the Black community and not quite fit in there because of, because you're reading comic books, or, it's interesting because we have forgotten, and it wasn't that long ago, but it doesn't surprise me that we have forgotten there was a time where, reading comic books was like the kiss of death for, the social kiss of death for a kid. And if you admitted that you read comic books, or it was found out that you read comic books, you had 2 options. 3. 1 was you could quit reading comics. 2 was you got wedgies on the playground. 3 was you learned how to fight. Most people went for option 1 and 2. I like comic books a little too much, so I learned how to throw down. I let my hands do some of the talking. I was, that little kid in 6th grade who was not afraid to get into a fight, even with older kids. But no kid should have to do that, right? And so I feel like part of my responsibility as a storyteller is to try to create stories that not only empower and speak to the readers, but also, tell a story of, look, I belong here, right. and that's Naomi. It's like, and the thing is what part of what Brian and I did, we didn't want to portray her as this outsider who feels like an outsider. If that's perceived, that's the readers bringing it there, right? That's the readers reading right. into it, projecting either their own concerns, their own beliefs. But we wanted to show that however she may or may not fit in, it's not the most obvious reasons, right? Because
and that's also where it becomes really true to form, because I mean, like you, I grew up as one of the onlys in high school and in middle school, and what was interesting is, like, when you're talking about what happens when people find out that you read comics, I had this weird double life because I was good in sports, so I made varsity teams, mm-hmm. as a freshman, and but it actually meant that I also started school at a younger age than all my peers. So I was really in over my head as far as age.
That's 3 strikes right there, man.
I was like the youngest. I was the youngest freshman hanging out with upperclassmen, I remember like we had gone to this one cross country meet, and it was really far away, and I had snuck some comics in. I was reading comics in the back of the van, and I left the comics when we got home. I left the comics in the van, and I remember walking into math class, and the math teacher was also the cross country coach, and he did it to humiliate me. As class starts, right? He reaches underneath the podium and pulls out the comics. He's like, "Oh, is this what you were reading? Here, you want them back?" And he threw them over the heads of other students into my lap. And of course, they scattered all on the floor.
They weren't mint anymore, were they?
I had to pick them up off the floor. But yeah, I led the charge when when it came time to TP his house at the end of the semester. So
there you go.
But it was like, it was like this ultimate moment of embarrassment.
Yeah.
Right. But I think that what's interesting in all of this is it's a moment of embarrassment, and it's also similar to what you're describing and what's happening with Naomi, which is that while we talk about her as being an outsider, when you're growing up in it, you just are an outsider.
Yeah.
You don't have the words for it. You normalize so much of it, but it's still something that you see, and it's still something that's actually really important to be able to engage with in terms of stories when you're that age, in part because you don't have the language to point that out and articulate your position.
Yeah, no, exactly. And I just think it's interesting that, I don't know, I think like in the case of Naomi, we have a character who looks just different enough in terms of what the traditional hero looks like, the traditional alienated youth who, which is usually looks like Peter Parker or somebody like that. I think that's why she appeals to a lot of people, and why she seems so different is because, we just haven't seen this yet. We haven't seen this enough that it's become normalized. And I think that, again, that I'm old enough and I've been out of high school for a very long time. And I know that I've talked to, other people over the years that I went to high school with who were like, talking about how alienated they felt. And I'm like, dude, you were the captain of the baseball team. Okay. You were dating the most popular girl in school. What are you talking about alienation? And that's when you realize that, that we all have our definitions of these things, and we all have our experiences. We all move through the world in slightly different ways. It's one of those reasons why I've just been enthralled with the show Cobra Kai, because it shows how much people can see the exact same thing so vastly differently. And I was just and to take it, to ground it within the context of the Karate Kid movies, which were, even when I was a kid, were not particularly good movies, and to turn it into something that is like so ridiculously entertaining, and it's an absurd show as far as I'm concerned, but it's ridiculously entertaining, and to go, oh yeah, no, this is, I get it. And I told somebody the other day, Cobra Kai is a show that I would have loved when I was 13, and I love it now that I'm in my 50s. But anytime between, say, age 15 and 45 or so, I would have hated it. I would hate everything about it. But it appeals to both the 50-something-year-old in me and the early to mid-teenager in me, which ain't easy to do, but they've done it. I think we've gone off topic at this point, so sorry.
No, we haven't. I think these are the interesting things, right? Is that you are ultimately, you're creating popular culture, right? Mm-hmm. And when you make a decision to do something that challenges some of the norms of popular culture, you're not just creating popular culture, you're changing popular culture.
That's
Um, and
I don't like to think about it that way, but
well, if you did think
if
about it
that's
that
how
way,
you want to see it, this is the sort of stuff we talk about all the time. You're not going to get me to admit this, so you can think that way, and I'll just go, okay, okay, Dr. Carpenter, okay, if you
well, but
say
here's the
so.
thing: if you thought about it that way when you were doing it, you probably wouldn't be able to do it effectively.
Hmm.
Or you'd just be like so stunningly arrogant that no one would want to talk to you. So the fact that we all still want to talk to you,
Thank you. I appreciate that. It's
says a
good to be
lot.
it's good to be surrounded by people who will call you on your BS. I didn't want to swear because I know families might be listening to it. But no, it's this is something that I struggle with a lot. And even today I was like, okay, is this my ego talking? Is this me allowing my ego to get in front of my work and guide it? Or is this, because to be good at something and to publicly say, hey, I'm good at what I do, is, especially for Black folks, can be frowned upon.
Right.
And so I try very hard to acknowledge that I've been fortunate enough to be involved in really good projects, but also to acknowledge the fact that they're not good just because of me. And that's that I know some creators that can't do that, and I feel sorry for them because they're the ones that nobody wants to be around.
And yeah. Well, it's interesting as we talk about these projects. Also because it's like it's almost like there's like you're the thread that brings them together, and there's definitely a common sensibility that you bring to all of them. But starting with Bitterroot as Black power fantasy, Naomi coming of age, and now you've got this Black Panther graphic novel. Not
Black
the
Panther
not Black Panther, the Black
Party.
Panther
Yeah,
Party,
yeah,
yes, graphic novel, which goes into finding a new way to bring history to life,
yeah.
right? um and the Black Panther Party graphic novel also comes on the heels of the Frederick Douglass graphic novel, right?
Yep.
So I'm really curious to hear some of your thoughts, especially with it still being so fresh, right?
Yeah.
I mean, well, by the time people listen to this, it will have been released, but
Just
it
barely,
hasn't been
though.
yet.
Just barely.
But yeah, I mean, tell us about that journey.
It's an interesting journey because I I always tell people, I teach part-time at Portland State University, and I especially tell my students that you have to be very conscious of the fact that opportunity seldom knocks on your door. More than anything else, opportunity is going to just plug your toilet. And if you're not willing to, and if you don't have a plunger, you've got to reach into that toilet and break it up, break up the big dookie log. And so for me, it was, there was a story that I always wanted to tell. For the last 30 or so years, I wanted to tell the story of Chairman Fred Hampton and the Illinois Black Panther Party and Hampton's murder at the hands of the Chicago Police Department. And and I always in the back of my head thought, this is a story I want to tell. I want to tell this particular story. And I knew about the Panthers. In I'll say I knew more about the Panthers than the average person, but I'm not going to say I was necessarily an expert. And so that was about the only thing in terms of nonfiction that I had ever thought about wanting to do something with in any capacity whatsoever. And then I was approached by Patrick Barb, who at the time was an editor for 10 Speed Press, who was a fan of my writing and just randomly said, would you ever be interested in doing anything nonfiction? And I said, well, maybe. And he said, because we're really interested in doing a book on the life of Frederick Douglass. And my first thought was, I don't want to write a book about Frederick Douglass. That's going to be hard, And then I thought, but if you don't do it, you may never get another opportunity to write a nonfiction book, which means you'd never get an opportunity to pitch your idea to do this Fred Hampton piece and da-da-da. So I said, sure, I'll do it. And then shortly after, and I had mentioned early on in the Frederick Douglass process of creating that script that, you know, I told Patrick about always wanting to do something about the life of Fred Hampton. And then when Frederick Douglass was done and it was out and we started having a conversation about what's next, you know, Patrick said, well, you know, we'd be interested in the history of the Black Panther Party. And I said, well, you know, I'm only interested in telling Fred Hampton's story. And this is where a good editor comes in, because Patrick said, yeah, you're interested in telling the Fred Hampton story because you know more about the Panthers than most people do. But in order for the Hampton story to really have emotional weight, people need to know as much as they can about the Panthers. And that's what, as a publishing company, that's what we're interested in doing. So once again, I said, okay, I'll go with that, you know. And by that point, I was really sort of hooked into this process of trying to help people access information in a way that's more readily available. And I think that that's what the comics medium does. I think that's what sequential art is capable of doing. And I remember thinking this while I was working on Frederick Douglass, when every book about Frederick Douglass is, you know, are these impenetrable texts that are, you know, David Blight's book is like 900 pages and there's hardly any pictures and it's just, and it weighs like 10 pounds. And I was like, I if I didn't have to read this book, I don't know if I would, you know, I don't know what, and I thought about what I was like when I was like 13, 14 years old and how I was engaged. And if it was a comic, it didn't matter what it was, I would check it out, right? I'd at least give it the time of day. And I put that energy into Frederick Douglass, and I sort of became addicted to that process. I'm doing a new book for 10 Speed, which I can't talk about yet because it hasn't been announced. And it's not quite as heavy in its subject matter, but it still requires a lot of research. And as I was, you know, after doing the Black Panther Party, after doing Frederick Douglass, I have really sort of gotten my research style down. And so I have all these source books and I'm reading through all of them. And I was like, this is all academic stuff. I was like, this is all the stuff Stanford reads and writes, and there are all these big words, and you know, and he's got the $10, $15 vocabulary, but me, you know, I'm that guy who barely graduated high school, and I just started thinking like, how much, and I really did. I didn't think about this just in terms of Black folks. I thought about this more in terms of instead of race, I thought about it more in terms of class than anything else, but which encompasses a lot of Black folks, but also encompasses white folks too. And I just thought, how much information and how much history is being lost or not taught because it's not being presented in an accessible sort of way. And I was like, you know, if this is where the rest of my career in this medium stays for the most part, I could be cool with that. You know, I could be cool with, if I didn't ever write another superhero book again, I'd be fine with that. I'm content with what I'm doing with Bitterroot right now. I love the nonfiction stuff, and I see a need, I see an opportunity, and I also know that I can't fulfill it all. I talked to John Jennings about this a lot, you know, about the curating subjects and finding other people to do stuff, and it's like, I desperately want a really good graphic novel about the life and times of Ida B. Wells. I don't want to be the one to write it. I don't want to be the one to do all the research. I want to be the one to read it, and I want to share it with other people. And then I realized, well, maybe I'm in a position to create a scenario or help to create a scenario where that book can get done. And maybe I'm in that position where someone can do, I mean, like there's, as far as I know, there's not even a really great, there's a couple good books about the Negro Leagues, right? But I was, you know, because recently Major League Baseball just announced that Negro League is now part of Major League, and all these players, all of whom have been dead for, you know, in some cases close to 100 years, are now going to be indoctrinated into the Hall of Fame. And I was like, there is not an easily accessible book about the Negro Leagues. and by accessible, I'm not talking accessible just to Black kids. I'm talking to anybody who wants to know about this
Right.
particular aspect of the history of baseball. And I was like, I'm not the guy to write it. I'm the guy to trumpet it, you know, it's toot its horn and tell people to support it. But how do I get myself into a position where I am the guy who can help greenlight it, and help make it happen? And I recognize that I'm fortunate enough that I'm in this position where there's not many of us creators in general, comic creators in general, let alone Black creators, who are, I guess for lack of a better term, carving out a niche for themselves in this world of nonfiction, you know, graphic novels. And so what I ask myself, you know, well, what do you do with it? And I think that that's interesting because that comes also from studying the life of Frederick Douglass and studying, you know, the Black Panther Party. And it's like, what do you do with what you have? You fight for it, you get somewhere. Do you just keep Frederick Douglass and just sit down and let his life, you know, after, you know, the Civil War is over and slavery ended, it wasn't like he went, oh, I'm done now. You know, there was always battles to fight. And so I think about that a lot. I think about what are my battles that I'm going to fight, who am I going to align with? And, you know, he became a suffragist. He was part of the suffrage movement, even though like nobody wanted him there. You know, it was a lot of women, Susan B. Anthony's and those folks, they they were less than tolerant of Black men and Black people in
Right.
general. So that's a topic for another time. But
But it's
yeah,
also
so
interesting what you describe, right? Is that you know, and I actually just had this conversation with someone who you and I both know, Frederick Aldama,
mhm.
right? About you know, talking about why we create, right? You know, I mean, and to hear you talk about like about how trepidatious high school was, about it being, you know, it being a struggle, right?
Yeah.
You know, and throughout this conversation, you talk about accessibility, and Frederick and I had similar conversations. Um, and then to hear you then talk about, I'm going to create a graphic novel that's going to talk about something that I wish I'd learned about earlier in life in a clear, accessible way, right? And I think that's where things get really interesting, right? Where you know, and the way you talk about an Ida B. Wells graphic novel, like
Mhm.
that's the book you want to read.
Yeah.
But the thing is, if you don't make it, who will?
Yeah. And that's a burning question. And so but I think that, you know, okay, if I have to be realistic, there's at the very least, there's a perception of me that is connected to power in some capacity, power within the publishing world, or sway or influence or whatever. And so the question then becomes not how do I get to write that Ida B. Wells book, because I got enough stuff on my plate. The key is
Right,
how do I create an opportunity for somebody else? Because out there, and you know this as well as I do, there's some young creator, and by young creator I mean, you know, anywhere from their teens into their mid 20s, and they got the juice to do it, but nobody knows them. They don't have the right connections,
right,
or maybe their talent is still a little rough around the edges. They need to be mentored a little bit, and I feel like that's, you know, that's part of the responsibility. I mean, that was how I was raised. That's how my grandparents raised me. So I you know, I remember while working on Frederick Douglass, I don't think I've ever admitted this publicly. I started getting books on Ida B. Wells because that was in my mind. That was because their paths had crossed, and he mentored her for a while. And there was a whole bunch of people whose lives I had to study just a tiny little bit as I was studying, but I studying their lives in the context of Frederick Douglass's life. Ida B. Wells, Harriet Tubman, John Brown, all these folks, and even Abraham Lincoln to a large extent. But of all of those people, Ida B. Wells was the one that just really kind of fascinated me the most. And so you know, like I said, I've never admitted this. I bought a bunch of Ida B. Wells books with the idea in mind that, yeah, maybe this is something I should tackle. And maybe someday I will, but I honestly feel like I would feel better if I could help somebody else do it. You know, I mean, I've 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 been up to the plate. I've swung at the ball. I've hit the ball a couple times, you know, and I'm still in the game. But I don't need to be, you know, I don't need to bat every inning. You know, I don't need to. There's some younger people that need some time off the bench. I can't believe I'm using sports metaphors because I'm not a sports guy at all. But I think you get what I'm saying. It's like,
right.
There are some individual creators that I know right now, and you know some of them too, like Vita Ayala, Che Grayson. Oh man, there's so many, and of course I'm drawing a blank on all of them right now. Regine Sawyer, and I know these creators, and I'm like, you know, and some of them, their careers are really taking off, but it's like, they're not taking off enough as far as I'm concerned. You know what I'm saying? It's like,
Right.
I want to see them do more. And maybe they don't want to do some of the things that I want to do. And maybe they don't have some of the same goals, but I know that they could do it. That's the thing. I know Vita is a good enough writer that they can tackle anything. You know, I don't know what Vita's overall interests are, and we've talked just a little bit about it, but you know, I'd go to bat for anything that Vita wants to do. And if someone handed me a check and said, start your own imprint and it's going to be nonfiction graphic novels, Vita would be one of the first people I'd turn to, because I know that they can get the job done.
I think that's what's interesting. I mean, it's kind of like that's the next stage, right?
Yeah.
And it's also a mark of growth, you know, because you're able to do what you're able to do because some other people had reached this point in their career,
Yeah.
right, where there were more things that they could do than they had time to do, and then it became about them empowering other people to take the baton and run with it, you know. And I think that these are the things that sometimes, you know, that we get so caught up in the struggle, in the present, right, that we really forget about the future, right?
Yeah.
We're so caught up at looking towards the horizon that we forget that at some point we're gonna get to that vanishing point.
Yeah. This is all very true. And so this is all, a lot of this stuff that I try to think about and try to address. And I just would like to, again, I just come back to the fact that I'm really lucky. And you know, I've had multiple careers in my life, and every single one of those careers has been something that was seemingly impossible for, you know, a poor, you know, poor biracial kid being raised by his white mother and his black grandparents. And I've done a lot, and I still, like I said, I still have a lot to do, but there was enough people who believed in me, both within my family and outside my family, that it's like, if I don't figure out a way to honor what they did for me and what others have done for me, then, you know, then I don't deserve what I have. It's part of the reason why I teach too. It's you know, I've been fortunate enough to learn stuff along the way, and you know, people put books in my hands and said, this book, you might not like all of it, but some of it's going to be really helpful. Check it out, you know? And so, yeah, I just feel like I don't want to be that person who waits till he's in his 70s to go, okay, how do I really start paying it forward? How do I start?
Right.
Yeah, I don't want to do that. Because I want to read that Ida B. Wells book in the next couple of years, you know? And again, if I can't make it a reality for somebody else to do it, maybe I will write it, but man, these nonfiction books kick your ass. I'll say that much. So.
Well, yeah. I mean, I was thinking about that when I was reading the Black Panther Party. You know, I mean, I was thinking about it stylistically, like you know, and you know, the decision to do entire sections of it more like almost like a picture book, and then other sections where you slip into much more of a sequential type of retelling. You know, and as I was reading, I started counting like all of the people's stories that you took a break to just, you know, kind of tell and flesh out the story.
Yeah.
Like all of those moments, right? I was like, you spent a lot of time, you know, but it wasn't just the time, but it's also, you know, I'm thinking of it in terms of what's it, you know, about what it must have been like for you to be like, you know, obviously you spent like, you know, say you spent like a week doing nothing but just writing up that section about Angela Davis, and then you've got, you know, then you got Fred Hampton, then you've got Eldridge Cleaver, right? And you've got all, you know, like almost chess pieces on a board. Like, how do I line all of this up?
I don't know how I did it, to be honest with you. I was flipping through the book the other day. I was also talking to Marcus, the artist, and we were both like, how do we do this? And I feel good about it. You know, I feel good because I know that at the end of the day, Marcus and I gave everything we were capable of giving in the time frame that we had. You're never going to have enough time to do everything the way you want it to be.
Right.
You're never going to have enough pages. You know, there was a point where I was, the book is close to 190 pages. And there was a point where I was like, this is too many pages. There's no way I can fill it. And then at some point I was like, well, this is not enough pages. And, you know, and then you're making the decisions about what to leave out, and, you know, because there isn't room. And, oh, this is a really interesting bit of history here, but yeah, maybe it's not quite appropriate for the target reader. And here's something I'd like to know more about, but I can't find any information. So there's so many tough decisions to be made. And to me, the most important thing was tell as much as you can possibly tell. And, but try really hard to not try to have so much in there that the book itself doesn't work. You know, it's like, if you don't explain who Huey P. Newton is well enough on page 4, or, you know, is really page 20 by the time we introduce him, somewhere in there, but you get what I mean. If you don't fully explain who Huey P. Newton is in the book and really give context to who he is, by the time you get to the end of the book, or even the middle of the book, and you mention Huey again, you don't want people going, well, who's Huey? Who's this Newton guy? You know, and that to me was one of the big problems with some of the other books I'd read about the Panthers, was this focus on 3 or 4 key people, and then everybody else is sort of, you know, lost in the shuffle in one capacity or another. And depending on who you talk to, like there's people who know who Emory Douglas is, right? But then there's other people like, who? And you're like, how do you not know who Emory Douglas is? Like in my mind, he's as important as anybody else. It may be even more so because he was, you know, the artist for the newspaper that they had for years. But then there's other people like Jonina, I can't think of her last name, but she ran the newspaper for years, you know, because the paper lasted until the 80s. She was just as important in her own way. And most people, you know, don't know who she is. There's like no pictures of her, you know, it's yeah.
Well, but I think that was a really good decision creatively, because ultimately this isn't the Black Panther. This is the Black Panther Party.
Yeah.
And what makes it the story of the Black Panther Party is that there are so many people. Like, part of me actually wished that you had either had more pages or even broken up into multiple books, so you could even bring more people in, right? Like in some ways, the smaller the big 3 became, the more interesting the story of the Black Panther Party became.
Yeah.
Because it was not about personality. You started to capture the mass. And I actually like the way you ended the book, where you actually articulated the decline.
Yeah.
Because oftentimes what frustrates me with stories about movement is is it kind of ends when the movement is at its peak.
Yeah.
As opposed to explaining how the decline happened.
Yeah.
Because the fact that there was a decline does not diminish what happened.
Yeah. No, exactly. It's just, if you just take the free breakfast program alone, that's worthy in and of itself of an entire book or an entire documentary. What I would like to see someday is, I would love to have had, and I don't want to belittle it by saying it this way, like a book that was almost a collection of trading cards, right? Where it would just be an image of all these people who were members of the party, even if it was, a sort of graphic, cartoonish representation with their name, where they were from, when they joined the party, just to acknowledge, because again, when we talk about the party, most people are talking about 20 people at the most, right? But there was thousands of members. When we talk about Fred Hampton and what happened to him in Chicago, him and Mark Clark being killed in the apartment, there were other people in the apartment, and most people don't know their names. Even I can't remember their names off the top of my head. I have to look it up. And so again, there's a handful of names that we know, but the rank and file aren't known. And this is the crucial thing. And this is what I've been saying in interviews the last few weeks as the book gets ready to come out, is that our parents and our grandparents and our aunties and our uncles and our cousins, there's still people alive today who are members of the party. There's still stories to be told. There's still understanding to be had. There's still mysteries to be solved, for that matter. And I would hope that maybe this book will motivate some people to ask some questions, whether it's questions to their parents or their grandparents or even their neighbors. Because I can't tell you how many people, and I'm sure this is happening, where there's at least one or two people you meet where you're like, oh yeah, my uncle was a member of the Panthers, or oh yeah, no, I live next door to this guy who, and it's like if I think, well, in my life, most of the Black folks I know of a certain age, I want to be very careful, the Black folks I know personally that I've met of a certain age, it seems like every single one of them has at least one person in their life that was either a Panther or like lived next door to them, Right. And it's like, and we're not talking about, this is an ancient history. I mean, the Panthers were still in existence when you and I were kids growing up.
Right.
There's a what is her name? The actress, she was on that show Z Nation, but she was also on the Bernie Mac show. She's just fine. Who is she? Not to sexualize her. Kalita Smith, I believe is her name. Kalita Smith. Okay. And you'd know if you saw her. She was on the Bernie Mac show. She played Bernie Mac's wife. Kalita Smith went to school at the Panther School in Oakland. At their, I want to say it was called the Freedom School. I forget some of the stuff, but there's a little mini documentary, and there's this interview with her, and it's, and I remember in my research just stumbling across it and just going, okay, so she's a few years younger than me, and she's been on TV shows and she's been in movies, and she's part of it. Right. There's this person who's part of our pop culture awareness, but she's also, Tupac Shakur, same thing. I mean, that's how much the Panthers are in our lives, is that they really have had this impact. And I just think,
because I had that too, that where I was in college, when we're talking about the Black Panther Party, and of course the guys are talking about it, and in a very kind of like all the masculinist aspects of it, right?
Yeah,
Oh, they walked around with guns. Look at how cool they look. Blah blah blah. And this one woman who also lived in our dorm, she kind of interrupted the conversation, and she said, "I knew the Black Panther Party. They were the people who fed me."
Yeah.
And everyone was like. Like didn't even know how to respond at first, because everyone was so caught up in one narrative, but I remember that was a really, that I actually remember that as a formative moment for myself of like also how you can have something like that where there's so many different perspectives of what it meant to different people.
Yeah.
And I loved how in the book you really captured the extent to which, you know, J. Edgar Hoover saw that school lunch program as the real threat.
Yeah, no, that was it.
It was like, oh, wait, that's the real threat, because that's independence.
Yeah, that's preaching against all of the propaganda that we've been fed, and it's empowering people and realizing that there is a way out of this status quo. We can
Right.
change things, and but the key to, you know, it's like, you know, in the Bob Marley song, you know, you have to liberate yourself from mental slavery, you know, and that's what they talked about. And you know, not to get too high up on my soapbox, but there's a lot to be said for trying to break down those barriers. And
Yep.
I think all we have to do is look on the news and see what happens when we allow those barriers to stand. You know, I feel like it's not to. I get caught up in studying history, you know, and it was General Sherman, William Tecumseh Sherman, who, you know, marched to the sea during the Civil War and just burned and pillaged and decimated the South, right? And that was in part because it was this belief, like, you have to utterly destroy your enemy and leave, you know, the concept of leaving no stone unturned, right? And that was a part of how the Union won the war. And then everything was done to apologize for it, right?
Right.
And it's like, well, what was the point of doing all of that, right? You made your point, and now you're going, oh, hey, sorry. And so I find it interesting because that's it. It's like, how do we? When I was working on the Frederick Douglass book, and I sort of suspected this even before I started working on it, but when I was really getting into it, and there's this old saying that history is written by the winners. And it was while I was working on that book that I realized, no, it's not, because the history of the Civil War as we know it was really written by the losers, you know.
Right.
And then when you really start studying the Daughters of the Confederacy and the Texas school boards and how, you know, their textbook decisions shaped our nation, or how, you know, a woman like Margaret Mitchell, who wrote Gone with the Wind, whose family were a bunch of anti-Reconstructionist Southerners, how she paints this picture in Gone with the Wind of the happy slaves and the noble, you know, Southerners. And suddenly we take that for being some semblance of the truth. And you know, I guess I want to be a myth slayer. You know, I want to, you know, and that's not to say I don't want to create my own myths. I would just like to kill off some of the ones that I was reared on, you know, so.
Yeah. Wow. So look, we're out of time.
Okay.
I think it's always good to end on slaying. You know, but yeah, I just really wanted to thank you for taking the time to talk with me, and for sharing our conversation.
Yeah, no, this is great. I mean, you know, normally we would be doing this, you know, in the lounge at the whatever that hotel is in San Francisco, and we'd, you know, be up late at night and falling asleep and having some of these conversations. So while this isn't the same thing, it's still good to be able to connect. And I, you know, the last time I did significant travel was when I was at BCAF last year. It's always a time for me to be around people I really care about and respect. And I'm happy that we're able to still do this in some capacity.
So thank you.